I think it's safe to say that Bernie Sanders has had an incredible week. So, as you all know, last week on the show, we talked about how he has proposed numerous sweeping policy proposals: criminal justice reform, a workplace democracy pro-union plan, a Green New Deal, which would potentially save the planet. And these proposals, generally speaking, have been received very well. Now, on top of that, he received an endorsement from the United Electrical Workers Union, which is huge. And also, polling is starting to show that he is, in fact, reclaiming his spot at the top. Now, as a general rule, you never really want to rely too heavily on just one poll individually, because polling data is much more reliable and stable at the aggregate level. However, polls are still useful at the individual level because they tell us that there may or may not be a sudden shift coming. And one poll from Monmouth University is demonstrating that maybe the tide is starting to turn in Bernie's favor even more and against Joe Biden. Now, I tend to not talk about individual polls, but this poll is important because it has the potential to unilaterally, on its own, transform national dialogue. Because up until this point, even though Bernie Sanders has solidly remained in second place, it seems as if everyone is just focusing on Biden and, to a lesser extent, Elizabeth Warren, and just ignoring Bernie Sanders. But this new poll from Monmouth makes it very difficult to not take Bernie Sanders seriously. And as Max Greenwood of The Hill reports, Joe Biden's support in the race for the Democratic presidential nomination is slipping, according to a new survey from Monmouth University poll that shows the former vice president dropping below 20%. The survey showed Biden with support from 19% of Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters nationally, a double-digit decline from Monmouth's most recent poll in June, when he led the pack with 32%. Now, the dynamics have changed. According to the Monmouth survey, Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, the primary field's top progressive candidates, are each at 20%, putting them in a statistical tie with Biden and indicating a tightening three-way race. So this obviously is phenomenal news. Now, a little bit more about this poll. It includes a random sample of 800 adults who were contacted both via cell phone and landlines. And it does have a relatively large margin of error at 5.7 percentage points, and generally, you want to try to keep that under 5%. However, demographically speaking, this poll actually does seem representative of the general public, and it does have a good mixture of young and old voters, as well as different racial groups. So, this is good. Now, getting to the results. As you can see, both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are tied for first place with 20%, and Bernie Sanders got the largest bump in terms of percentage. And Joe Biden is now in a statistical tie with Bernie and Warren at 19%, so he's just 1 point behind. But he did see the biggest decrease, which is in the double digits, as the article pointed out. And when you compare his numbers, from August to June, this drop is absolutely devastating for Joe Biden. Now, you then see Kamala Harris in a distant fourth place with 8%, Cory Booker and Pete Buttigieg tied for fifth with 4%, Andrew Yang in fifth with 3%, Julian Castro, Beto O'Rourke, and Marianne Williamson tied for sixth place with 2% each, and Bill de Blasio, Tulsi Gabbard, and Amy Klobuchar tied for seventh place with 1% each. Now, everyone else is either polling at less than 1% or 0%, with a total of 10% of voters saying that they are undecided. Now, when it comes to who's leading in states with early primaries here, we see Elizabeth Warren with the biggest jump at 20%, tied with Biden, and Bernie in third with only a 1% jump in comparison with June. Now, the biggest aspect of this story, arguably, is that Joe Biden took a gigantic hit in the polls. And polling is starting to show more and more that this primary is starting to shape up into a standoff between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, which is actually good news because these are two of the better options in this race. You see a ton of corporate Democrats and centrists, so to see the more left-wing candidates kind of be the frontrunners, that is good, although we do have to defeat Elizabeth Warren, because when it comes to her versus Bernie, I'm sorry, the difference is still night and day. Even though she is better than Biden, and I'm glad to see her overtake Biden, Bernie Sanders is the candidate who wants to change the system itself and not just reform it. So when it really does come down to a race between Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, if that is in fact the case, then I think it will be useful for us to focus more heavily on the differences between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. But for now, it still makes sense that we continue to drive home the point that Joe Biden is not electable. Joe Biden is a gaffe machine, and Joe Biden, he doesn't have the policies, he's not going to excite the base, and he could potentially lose to Donald Trump. And what's really odd is that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they are not cutting into each other's bases. One is not taking votes away from the other. However, what I would not have expected, prior to this primary, is that Bernie Sanders is actually the second choice for a lot of Joe Biden's supporters. So the implication with regard to the Monmouth poll is that as, Joe Biden goes down, Bernie Sanders goes up. In other words, Biden's loss is Bernie's gain, weirdly enough. And I think that a lot of this has to do with name recognition and not necessarily so much with policy. So assuming that Joe Biden will continue to fall, that should theoretically give Bernie Sanders a boost over Warren if, Bernie Sanders does remain the second choice for a lot of Biden supporters. But again, I want to stress that this is just one poll. It could very well be an outlier, so I don't want to get your hopes up just yet. But it could signal a change, in this race. This could change the dynamic. And again, this could very well mean that national dialogue changes just because this poll is so devastating for Joe Biden. And it could kind of become this self-fulfilling prophecy where this poll leads to mainstream news pundits asking questions about whether or not Joe Biden is dropping. And then, that is reflected in the polls because that becomes the narrative. So it's still important to talk about individual polls just for purposes of kind of setting or changing really the narrative. Now, the reason why I really wanted to cover this, even though I try to stay away from individual polls, is because of the response that this garnered. All of the headlines now, from Politico, The Hill, they're all saying that Biden is falling and Bernie is rising, as well as Elizabeth Warren. And I have to share with you the response from MSNBC, because they basically, up until this point, believed that Joe Biden just couldn't possibly fall. They largely ignored Bernie Sanders. Even Nate Silver, the whiz kid, apparently claimed that this would be a race between Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren. But now this poll is changing the discourse. And it's really nice to see that. So this is a compilation of MSNBC clips put together by Jeff Miami on Twitter. It's not the best quality, but nonetheless, it still is fascinating. Take a look.
The Sanders movement is strong and it is durable, and she's obviously got a lot of momentum, but they are not right now taking votes away from each other. And the problem is, if you look at the crosstabs in this poll, Bernie Sanders is starting to take votes away from Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And that is a problem for Joe Biden because he's got a lot of moderate candidates going after him. But he's also got a working class candidate from the left who's chipping away at some of his support. He's got a lot of issues coming from a lot of different people from a lot of directions.
I'm stunned to see Bernie Sanders doing so well after he's been not doing so well. And I think that's an indication that we're not entirely sure where this is going to look, at Thanksgiving as opposed to when voting starts in February.
I think it's such a smart point because I always love the reminders of how much we miss. The national media misses so much of what happens on the ground for these campaigns and these candidacies. And while the Sanders campaign isn't all sort of above ground, there is sort of a movement. I was surprised to see him tied with Warren and Biden. It's important to point out that this poll has a 5 to 7 point margin of error. Biden campaign pushing back vigorously against its findings. David Jolly, your thoughts?
Look, you've got to put this in the context of Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. And Elizabeth Warren's in a very good spot in Iowa. She very well might overtake Biden. I think for Bernie Sanders, it comes down to New Hampshire. And as things fluctuate, we don't often talk about Bernie Sanders because his numbers always kind of stay the same. I mean, he has a very loyal constituency. But as Biden falls, all of a sudden Sanders is now in range. Warren and Sanders have a real competition in New Hampshire. And I think whichever one comes out on top in New Hampshire is looking very good to be the foil to Joe Biden.
I don't like that. It's hard to war game all this out, but I'll say two things. One is, if you're Joe Biden, I don't care how big the margin of error is, to be losing that kind of altitude in a respectable poll like this has got to make you a little bit nervous, especially since you built your whole campaign on the premise of, I'm the electable one, I have the area of inevitability. Once that starts to get chipped away, you start to see those downward numbers. that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The other thing, to your point, Nicole, is that people have made a fundamental mistake with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Everybody puts them in the same bucket. They're the left wing. They're the progressive part. They are not gathering the same voters. Bernie Sanders' coalition is a middle class and down coalition. Her coalition is a upscale college coalition. They are definitely both on the progressive side, but by and large, it is not the same coalitions those two are putting together. And they could both go very deep into this nomination fight because the Sanders movement is strong and it is durable, and she's obviously got a lot of momentum, but they are not right now taking votes away from each other.
So I haven't said this in a really long time, but good job, MSNBC. I mean, you see just constantly them basically doing pro-Biden propaganda. Kyle Kulinski covered a segment that they ran where they talked about all of Joe Biden's gaffes and included Claire McCaskill, and she basically said, well, look, Joe Biden may be a gaffe machine, but, we understand what Joe Biden is saying and trying to say. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I mean, up until this point, they're all about Joe Biden, but now they just can't really do that because Joe Biden isn't necessarily this powerhouse that they thought he was. And, this poll indicates that maybe he's the house of cards that progressives were saying he was. Again, could be an outlier, but we need to see Joe Biden's numbers plummet. And this poll is the first indication that they are, in fact, plummeting. Not just steadily declining, but plummeting. Because if you see a double-digit drop from June from the same polling outlet, that is absolutely just devastating and crushing, I'm assuming, to, Joe Biden's team. I'm sure that they are terrified. So some of the things that they acknowledged here, that Biden is having his votes taken away from Bernie Sanders because as, Joe Biden's support base jumps ship, it seems like they're going to Bernie, which again is weird. I did a video on this talking about why that may be the case. And largely, I'm chalking this up to name recognition, but I mean, what Joe Biden is losing, Bernie's gaining. And him and Liz, they just don't have the same support bases. And one of the pundits said it best. Bernie's coalition is a middle class and down coalition, and Warren's coalition is an upscale college education. So wealthy whites love Warren, and poor voters, also including communities of color, voters from all different demographics, love Bernie Sanders. So you really do see this true rainbow coalition with Bernie, and that's great. Now, I love that they actually admitted here that national media misses everything. And they finally acknowledged that Bernie has been polling in second place. And someone even said, I'm stunned Bernie Sanders is polling so well. I mean, how do you miss this? He's consistently been in second place. He was in first place until Biden entered the race, and then he fell to second, and then you see this surge from Warren where she kind of overtakes Bernie in certain polls, but still, when you look at aggregate polling data, Bernie is in second place. So the fact that they dismissed him doesn't necessarily tell me that they care about the numbers. They just want to downplay Bernie, so they hope that this will kind of, be reflected in the polls where voters will think, oh, well, Bernie must be going down because that's what I hear from mainstream media. So they have an agenda. But when the numbers change so drastically as we're seeing from this Monmouth poll, it's kind of difficult to dismiss it because you just look like a hack. And they already look like hacks, but you don't want to appear that you're biased and you have an agenda to just normal voters who don't necessarily follow politics as closely as you or me. So overall, this surge is absolutely just such good news, and I'm trying not to get my hopes up too much because you never want to put too much stock in one poll, but just gauging the noise that this poll made, in political discourse, in national corporate media, it tells me that this could be a continuing trend. So I'm crossing my fingers that this is signaling a brand new trend where we see Bernie and Warren overtake Biden. And then as progressives, what we do is we shift away from Biden and we start focusing on the differences between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, because the differences are many. Warren may be a solid candidate, but she's flaky on Medicare for all. She's awful when it comes to foreign policy. And then we just need to convince people that it's Bernie who you want, because he's the person who is saying very clearly that I want to change the system and not just tweak it. That's what Warren wants to do. So it'd be nice to just have this be a race between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and us not have to focus so much on Joe Biden. And that's what the polls are showing. So I'm going to watch this closely, really look at the next couple of polls, the next 2 to 3 polls that come out, and see if the results from those polls kind of mirror what we're seeing here in this Monmouth poll, because then that will tell us that this is in fact the start of a new trend, which will be great news. So all around, if you're a burner, today's a good day.
Subscribe if you like this video, folks. Mike's tremendous, and he's doing a really, really good job. Many people are telling me about how wonderful the Humanist Report is. Bigly.